Now to introduce our speakers. We have Rick Lowe, an artist and social sculptor from living in Houston, who's forged links between the conceptual and commercial. We're in his show right now, Notes on Social Sculpture, which runs through October 22nd at the gallery. Over the past 3 decades, Rick has evolved a malleable practice centered on catalyzing change through the transformation of shared sites and structures. His work is included in the Brooklyn Museum, the Whitney Museum, ICA Miami, McNeil Collection, MFA Houston, among many others. He has also participated in the founding of many community-based art projects, including Project Row Houses, the Watts House Project, Borough Project, Greenwood Arts Project, and more. In 2013, President Obama appointed Rick on the National Council on the Arts, and in 2014, he won MacArthur Fellow. Eugenie Tsai is the John and Barbara Vogelstein Senior Curator of Contemporary Art at the Brooklyn Museum. In 2001, she organized Cause, What Party, The Slipstream, Reflections, Resilience, and Resistance in Art of Our Time. Rick was in that show, and coordinating the Brooklyn Museum's participation at Obama Portraits. And she's currently working on several exciting shows at the museum, and so please, go over there to the Brooklyn Museum. Tom Finkelpearl organized 15 shows at PS1 in the 1980s, worked on over 100 public art commissions at the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in the 1990s, and spearheaded a 50,000 square foot expansion during his tenure as director of Queens Museum from 2002 to 2014. He oversaw cultural funding in the city's first cultural plan when he returned to DCLA as the commissioner. He has published several books, Dialogues in Public Art and What We Made, Conversations on Art and Social Cooperation, both of which Rick Lowe and Project Row Houses are featured. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rick, Eugenie, and Tom.
It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight, Rick. An unexpected pleasure. And you're well known as one of the leaders in the world of social practice. And that's a world in which art unfolds in real time. It unfolds in communities, often under-resourced communities, and over a long period of time. And so, that world of social practice is well outside the world of the commercial gallery. So, where we are tonight in a blue chip gallery in Chelsea. But I have to say that sitting here, enveloped in your paintings, it's a really sensational show, and it feels so good, and it feels so right. And congratulations to Antoine and his team for making this happen. There are a lot of things we could talk about tonight, and I know we have a finite amount of time, so I'm just going to start at the beginning. I remember in the late 90s, I was at Skowhegan, and I attended your artist talk. And I don't remember details, but I remember that you showed slides of large figurative paintings with political content. That's all I remember, just kind of impressionistic, but I also remember distinctly how surprised I was to find out that you had started your career as a painter. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I remember that presentation at Skowhegan because it was, at that time, I was, about 4 or 5 years into social practice, social sculpture, and I wasn't telling people a lot about paintings, the painting part, and but I did decide to put them in that presentation. I don't know why. I think because it's called Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. I felt like I needed to have something to do with painting in there. But yeah. So my early days. So this is even the part of the figurative kind of didactic political paintings wasn't even the beginning. I mean, the beginning I started out as just a traditional landscape painter. And
Impressionist-like landscapes, or?
no, much more, you know, but some of my favorites, I mean, I mean, the paintings I was infatuated with were people like Camille Corot and, you know, even the Hudson River painters and all these people,
Real traditional?
Yeah, real traditional.
Did you paint from life?
Yes, some of them paint. I mean, I would go out and find a nice spot in the woods and, and paint these, pastoral kind of, paintings and stuff. That was the beginning. And but then I mean, because I was fascinated by this whole notion of art. I didn't have it early on. I mean, it wasn't something I was familiar with, so I was getting to know it. And but then once I kind of started to get into it, then I wanted to do things that were much more reflective of what I was thinking about in my life, politics and that kind of stuff. So that's when the shift happened.
So when you made those large figurative paintings with political content, like, why did you make them? And where did you show them in galleries? Were they made for a specific occasion?
Yeah, well, now you get into that point where you can talk with that point about, like, I'm sitting here in this blue chip gallery playing in the commercial market kind of thing. It is really a complete turn from before, because I remember specifically when I was painting the landscape paintings at that time, one of the things that concerned me about them was where were they going, and what was I using my talents and skills for? And I didn't feel like, using them to supply things for people's homes was what I was interested in at that time. And so
the over the sofa kind of painting.
Yeah, right. I wasn't, it wasn't my idea that I should paint these things so it could go into somebody's house and, that kind of stuff. So I started doing figurative work, but then I had these safeguards to keep it from going over the sofa, which was to make them really crude. I used plywood, house paint, and then I started making them big, kind of, I mean, some of them even bigger than these, but because they were intended to be more public art kinds of things. So it went into the public art realm. And so it was kind of the opposite. I mean, so my 20-something-year-old self would have just completely criticized me for this moment. It would have had no basis whatsoever to understand, but it wouldn't have had those like 40 years in between of experiences of knowing how life shifts, our abilities to do work in different ways shift, so yeah. But that 20-something-year-old person would have been outside protesting me right now.
Well, should I?
Yeah.
So one of the switches happened. I was just talking to Tanya Bruguera, a wonderful social practice artist, and she was talking about the difference between making political art and making art politically. Mm-hmm. And you made this switch between making political art, the big, and I know that you were making some of those as backdrops for, yep, press conferences around social justice issues. And you flipped the switch to making social practice art with Project Row Houses. Yep. And that's a pretty well-known story, but can you just go quickly, like, how did you make that switch? And then I want to talk about a social practice project or two.
Yeah, the switch from making political art to making art political?
Politically, yeah.
Politically, I mean, yeah.
Is there a catalyst?
That's the story, the piece at the Whitney that was in the Whitney Biennial. It was, getting to a point where the political paintings were serving a purpose and was successful by any means, I think. The last big piece was dealing with police brutality back in 1990, and it got coverage on all the press, so it was like a successful thing until this student basically challenged me and said, while your work shows what's happening in our communities, that's not what we need. If artists are creative, why can't they create solutions? So that's the title of that piece that was in the Whitney Biennial. And that was the thing that just kind of turned things upside down for me, to start thinking about, how to think, maybe a little bit more sophisticated about, how to approach these political thoughts and ideas that I have. That's not, just, it didn't have to be on the street, on the ground in that way, in that very didactic way. Because at that time also, those paintings in that work was from a strong activist perspective where, and I always tell people that, to me, one of the differences between an artist and activist is that activists have to be definite about what's right, what's wrong, which way to go, that kind of stuff, because you're driven to a certain point, so everything's black and white. But as an artist, you end up questioning things a lot more, and so I think actually, moving into the social sculpture work, I became more of an artist, actually, for me, because I was making the work, and there was a kind of urgency about it, but also it was about asking questions. I was trying to learn and understand, things, as opposed to, going from the perspective that I had the answers and I had to get everybody else to understand it.
So, the project that you then embarked on for 22 years of your life, which is still going on, obviously, Project Row Houses. I was thinking about, and I think everybody knows the story. It grew from a series of 8 houses. It's now 54 buildings.
A lot.
It's a lot of buildings.
Yeah,
it's a campus. If you ever go there, my feeling about this, and we talk about social practices, you cannot experience it by looking at pictures. You have to be there, and you have to walk through the space. And there's some people in this room who've walked through that space and spent time there. And then there's Rick, but then there's a lot of other people involved, and the people creating that are a series of collaborators. So I was just wondering about that idea for that period of time and those social practice, the difference between having the brush in your hand and controlling it versus being a part of a community that's forming something together.
Yeah. Well, that part is, once again, it's the part that open things up, where, in the studio you have control, and you're making decisions and that kind of stuff. But, in the social context, there's so many things that you can't do. You can't do everything. And in fact, I think there's a fault when artists actually do community engaged projects and they overly assert themselves. They kind of crowd out the opportunities for other people to be engaged and be involved. That's a big problem, I think. But so for me, it became something that was, I didn't know that this was going to happen, but as I started to work on the project and realized that it was much bigger than anything I could do on my own, and I had to recruit other people and work with other people, then I just fell in love with this idea of just being a facilitator, and trying to help people bring their ideas to being in the context, an overall context. Yeah.
So I also just briefly to talk about another project. So Project Row Houses, again, well known. You were there. You've been out of Project Row Houses for what, 5-6 years? When did you leave Project Row Houses?
Yeah, in end of 2017, early 2018,
so
yeah.
Around that time, also, you founded another project, which was Documenta, just closed in Kassel, Germany, but you were in the last Documenta. And can you tell us a little bit the story about the Victoria Square project in Athens, Greece?
Yeah, well, one of the things for me about community engaged work is, to me, it was a practice. And I think, and I say that because it's important to me as an artist to practice something and do it in multiple situations because you're learning and you're growing. It's like painting, you don't paint the same painting, or if you're painting it, you're trying to figure stuff out about in each one. They're each distinct in their own way. And so the opportunity to work through Documenta it was fascinating. It came at a fascinating time. Prior to that, I had worked on a project in Dallas around immigrants, and so that kind of got my I had a framework for understanding. In Dallas, the project was called Translation Vickery Meadow. And that project dealt with a concentration of refugees that were located in North Dallas. There were groups like the International Refugee Committee and Catholic Charities that were locating people there. And so I got a chance to kind of deal with the issue of immigrants, which was kind of tough for me because, I'm not an immigrant. I always felt comfortable working in like Project Row Houses or in the Watch Project, and projects that they're African American, and I feel like I have a voice there. So working on the project in Dallas, it gave me the opportunity to really push this notion of stepping back and being the background person and putting other people up front. That prepared me for the Documenta project, though. In Documenta 14 was in both Kassel and Athens. And I chose to put most of my energy in Athens. And it was an interesting time because my first trip to Athens was in June of 2015. And that was a very dynamic time there. There was a run of the banks. There was referendum on whether to leave the EU. There were refugees flooding the borders, and it was such a crazy time. And I was so fascinated by that. And so when I was asked to do something, in 2015 I went for a conference, and then I came back and I was asked by someone from Documenta if I would participate. So it was almost like it just kind of meant to be. I already had some relationship there. And then I went back and I did this project around dealing with immigrants and refugees and the relationship to the local Greek community, because there was this incredible tension at that time. And I just, I'm a strong believer in the capacity of culture to create a place of dialogue,
So, but the project was a place.
Yeah, it was a place.
So it's like a storefront, and it's right next to this big park, which was where kind of the center of immigrant
right next to the square.
Yeah, and I was just looking at a tape about that, and there was these newspapers done on a weekly basis or daily basis.
Yeah.
Which was comparing businesses. So it's all this kind of dynamic stuff around communication, and it's still going. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing for me, and I think this is probably, my sensibility as a visual artist. I wasn't painting, but I still have this notion of kind of what's visual. How does the visual work? And through Project Row Houses, it was exploring how does the visual in architecture work, and that helped me with the Victoria Square project. In fact, my collaborator on that project, Maria Papadimitriou, who came to my rescue because I didn't speak Greek and I didn't know the context, and she's a very well-known artist there. But one of the things she would always bug me about, she'd just go, "How did you find that space?" Because the space makes it. It is the space. It's about the architecture, and I'm pretty intuitive about space, and so that project, it became like this hub of a community that actually, that project is like, there's so many exciting things that have happened there that all of a sudden, during the last electoral season, there was a mayor's forum, which all 7 candidates were there at Victoria Square project.
Really? Wow.
The community leaders chose that project as a location to the Kyriakos Mitsotakis, who's now the prime minister, made his way to the project. He was, this is before he became elected, but and what it was symbolic though about this kind of space in which cross-cultural dialogue can happen without the kind of tensions that.
Yeah, partially because you call it art. I'm going to hand it back over to Eugenie after one more thing. I just want to say something.
Go ahead.
We're going to talk about the paintings. So I had this thing. So I often come up with my best ideas either when I wake up in the morning or when I'm in the shower. So I was like, okay, so in the shower last night, I was like, so what's in common? Because we're about to start talking about the paintings between all your work, starting with the paintings, the social practice. So here's my theory. So enthusiastic intersectional complexity. So if you knew the young...
That's a lot.
If you knew the young Rick Lowe, like with dreadlocks running around Project Row houses and that kind of energy, and it's intersectional because of sort of all the different kind of communities that were being brought together there, and then it was always very complex. And when I look at the paintings, I see that same sensibility. It's very different. Anyway, so I just thought I would spring that on you.
I like that, but I have to write it. You have to write it down for me because I have to live.
I got it right here. You got it.
I have to live with that for a bit. You know? Yeah.
Okay. So then.
So was there, so there was the student who asked you the leading question, why can't you find solutions? Was there something similar that happened that kind of drew you toward painting again?
Probably just wear and tear, I mean, wear and tear of working on community projects and having to kind of rethink that question. I mean, that was the impetus for me going into doing, social practice. This idea that, artists can create solutions. Trying to prove that artists can create solutions. To getting older and realizing that, maybe, but maybe not. And maybe that's not even the point. Maybe the point is not to create solutions, but to be engaged in the process of exploring it. And I think that's something that has kind of hit me as someone who's worked, in kind of institution building, organizations, and that kind of stuff, where, nowadays, people want to put social practice projects in a matrix, to figure out, impacts and all that kind of stuff, and they want to be able to measure it.
Quantifying.
Yeah, quantifying and all that kind of stuff, and to me, that's just, that's not the best way to value social practice or work that's intending to work with communities. I mean, it's just not. I mean, because you're never gonna measure up. Artists do a work about homelessness or housing. I mean, you'll just never win. And so it took a little kind of repositioning, the thinking. And I think that also opened up this space for me to want to be a little bit more reflective, and to think about these issues, that I've worked on for so long, and start thinking about, the meaning of them and the value of them and that kind of stuff. So that, I think that was the seed. I mean, it was just that inner desire to be more reflective, which you don't really have a lot of time to do that when you're working on projects. You're really trying to get from one step to the next, to the next, to the next. Everything's so urgent and
Yeah, no, you texted some of the things you were working on, and I kind of thought, working on social projects must be one of the most, however rewarding, one of the most demanding things, because you're working with a lot of people over a long period of time, and we all know that people are not always easy to work with, and it does require a certain set of skills and patience. And then I thought it must be so exhilarating to be in the studio by yourself, making all of your own decisions, calling your own shots, having this incredible sense of freedom and kind of exuberance and play, just to do whatever you want to do without having to consult with anyone, and just, I don't know, it just seemed kind of exhilarating, the thought of that. And then I also was wondering about the pandemic, because we had some Zoom dinners during the pandemic, and there were these paintings in the background that we kind of caught a glimpse of, and we were like, so what are these, And you said, oh, I've been doing some paintings, and then you showed us later what you'd been working on, and there were an incredible, I mean, it was just a huge body of work. And it was clear that you had just been spending inordinate amounts of time in the studio painting.
Yeah.
And so I mean, when you look at these paintings, like I know these relate to Project Row Houses, and these relate to Victoria Square. And so I'm trying to kind of figure out the relationship between your work in the world out there and your work in the studio, and how you're moving forward with that, how you're thinking about that.
Yeah.
And also the pandemic question.
Yeah. Well, you know, it was, I mean, Tom, you mentioned that earlier about Tanya Bergera's terminology. So it's social practice is drainage, is social drainage, emotional drainage. Yeah.
Emotional drainage.
It was, you know, that work is emotionally draining and taxing, whatever. And then the studio work is kind of the emotional fulfilling. You know, you get to fill back up, and I think the pandemic for me. I mean, I was making work prior to the pandemic, but I was also doing these community projects, so I wasn't like full on. And when the pandemic happened, it just gave me like a big block of time to refill. You know, I mean, I spent like 25 years of, you know, draining, and then I had basically a year of the pandemic to just fill up, you know, and it was an incredible time for me to also to kind of rethink even myself, you know, and how I, you know, yeah, just who I am as a person. One of the things that as a teacher, I teach, you know, social and community engaged art at University of Houston, and you know, and I always tell my students that one of the things I encourage them to do is to write out who they think they are. You know, I mean, what's your temperament? You know, how do you know, are you extroverted? Are you introverted? Do you like talking to people? You know, just lay it all out. And then you start thinking like, well, if this is who I am, then I should probably kind of work in this way. You know, and if I, you know, because if I don't like talking to people, then I need to figure out another way to do my community engaged work. And I had defined myself as this like ferocious extrovert, you know, just out at every opportunity and engaging with people all the time until the pandemic. And then I realized, oh my God, I love being alone. You know, I mean, it was amazing, you know, and it brought back like I started going back to these childhood things of like going to the you know, these little churches that my family would go to. You know, we'd go to these little, you know, and it just reminded me being in the studio was like being at church. You know, you're just sitting there and you're just, you know, doing your thing, you know, and yeah, so it was a complete different, you know, turnaround for me. So now I'm having to rethink all that stuff. You know, I can be, you know, extroverted, I can be out, I can do stuff, but also finding that I need that time, you know, inside to just kind of reflect.
I mean, this question of evaluation and, you know, so what makes a successful project? And you're saying you're never gonna, it's never gonna add up, like, you know. And so there was a critique of Project Row Houses that we both read and we've talked about, which said, and this is from a smart guy who I admire named Ben Davis, who I disagreed with this article vehemently. But
I didn't disagree with it. Okay.
And I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. Yeah. So he said, as great as Project Row Houses is, and there's a lot of great stuff, let's just be clear that things got worse off in housing and other areas, essentially for Black and brown folks in Houston during the time, those 22, 30 years that it's been going on. So is that the standard we're going to hold it to? In other words, are you going to judge it against, let's say, a housing program? Because there is housing at Project Row Houses. So that whole question, and the thing is that I was mad and defending Rick, and Rick was being the self-doubting artist.
No.
So anyway, go ahead. Just throw that out.
No, I wasn't self-doubting, but I was just, in the field of social practice, there's so little like real critique that, I was very, very excited that somebody was gonna like just, try to critique it.
Yeah.
Even though I think his bases were not bases that I would use, and I think that are healthy to use in the practice, but it was interesting to take that, and so I just wasn't in a rush to criticize. I wanted to engage more, to kind of understand, and yeah.
I mean, we had the same kind of issue, let's say, with the cultural plan in New York City, where people are saying, "You're not solving the problems of the city." Mm-hmm. At which point, I had to say that, what they were saying in the People's Cultural Plan, which was the critical cultural plan opposing us, which I had a lot of sympathy for, they were essentially saying we want to change the system, the full system, and essentially saying, the problem is capitalism, which I kind of agree with also. But anyway, I'm just saying that the other thing that came through my mind recently was Mark Stern. We did an interview together with Mark Stern. At the end of the interview, he said that judging success of organizations is usually based around things like institutional growth, and kind of a certain result orientation. But that when he's studied small organizations, especially small social justice organizations, he calls them irrational organizations. And that there's an irrationality and a passion in the organizations that I've seen. Anyway, I just thought that was sort of an interesting model for an art practice also. Because art practice is generally thought to be irrational.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, because, most of it is investigatory, right? I mean, you're investigating things. It's not like, you're building on, a body of work that have proven something that you're trying to take it to another level of proof or whatever. We're always exploring. We're always at the beginning of something all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're sitting in front of this incredible painting, and it's so radiant. I feel almost this heat generating from the colors. So I'd like to talk a little bit about your use of color in your paintings and also the titles. Some of the titles, again, refer to social projects, but others seem to be dates. And I'm wondering if the significance of those dates, are they diaristic? Do they mark a particular memory of a place? And also the choice of colors, are there associations with place or with mood or with, because they're all so different and vibrant.
Yeah, I mean, I have there is a side of me that's, even though I tried to deny it, like in my early days of painting, when I decided I didn't want to do landscape painting, I was kind of anti-formalism. But there's a side of me that really, I like the way color can be used to evoke certain kinds of feelings or certain kinds of ways of thinking. I like shapes and those kind. Even when I wasn't painting, I remember the curator who curated me in Documented, and I was walking around with her and Stanley Whitney, and I just, she would see me always snapping photos of just on the ground stuff, because I just like looking at interesting surfaces, interesting, there are compositions around this all the time, and she was like, I know I have you here doing this social practice project, but you're just a painter. Really? She was saying that. Yeah, she picked that up. I didn't think anybody was watching me, in that way. But it's, there is so the color and stuff. It just comes from my, there's a lot of random stuff with me. It's just about what's available. But once I find out what's available and I put something on, then I get into this notion of like, how do I make this work? How do I make this pink and yellow work? And how many times do I have to go over this pink to make it like work with this yellow? Or this one over here. I remember I sent this piece, one of the Gagosian teams, when they received this piece, they said they were like completely shocked because it didn't look like it looked in the photograph at all. And it was just one of those moments where, I had completed the painting. It was complete, but there was, but just kind of looking at color and working on things, and I was working on something else that had hints of that red in it, and next thing I know, so it's kind of like, if it just like made its way over onto that piece, so I don't have a set way that I use color, but it's certainly intuitive, and it kind of grows from one painting to the next, and I respond, to different things, like the piece back here, this dark piece and the piece in the back room there. There was like about 5 paintings at that time were happening in the studio, and they were all dark paintings, and my mentor, Jesse Lott, comes in, and he walks around, he looks around, and he goes, sure is dark in here. And then the next thing, that just kind of, I wasn't even thinking about it. I was just making work in ways that allowed me to explore these formal qualities of paint and texture. It just wasn't there. And then when he said that, it kind of woke me up and shook me out. And then I went kind of into a whole different way. So.
You've also talked about these in terms of maps, or there's a kind of aerial perspective or overview. And of course, I can't help thinking of your early interest in landscape. Yeah. And how a landscape now manifests itself in a different way.
Yeah. It is. It's, I had, all these different stages in my, from the landscape painting to the more didactic stuff to the social practice to, these abstract works or whatever. I can speak of them in hindsight in ways that makes it seem like there were some rational decisions that were made, but it was not. They were just all very, very organic. I had no idea that Project Row Houses would become what it became. There was just an impulse to try to explore something that was deeply rooted in the community and art in a different way. I didn't know it was going to go to that. When I started doing the first domino drawings, playing dominoes, I had no idea that these things were going to start to take on mapping shapes. They do it on their own. It's not, I didn't design it that way. It's like when I would before I even start doing the drawings, I would take photographs of games that we would play. I would always just do an aerial shot of a game. And you take those, and once you layer them over, they just come out looking like maps, And so it wasn't something that I set out to do. But I was happy because I had spent a lot of time at Project Row Houses looking at maps and trying to understand how, what maps could tell us about the possibilities of community, both, the history and the future. I learned, you got to learn how to read infrastructure maps, because if somebody's spending a lot of money on infrastructure, there's going to be some heavy development there. You've got to learn, the real estate, side, all those. At one point at Project Row Houses, I think it was probably in 1996, 97, no, maybe 97, 98, our little office space, the whole thing was just covered with maps of our community from every different angle. And, and then, so it was just kind of like this natural thing that I went from those kind of maps to these kind of maps or whatever. And yeah.
Okay, so we have these questions. So here's my suggestion. I will take one and hand you the pile.
I can't look through them to find the one I want to ask.
That's what I'm saying.
When Antoine was talking about doing this talk, and he said, who do you want to do a talk with? And I went over a number of different people, and then I just thought, you know what? I mean, I've known Tom, and Tom and I talk a lot. Mostly it's about basketball, but but you know, I've known Tom forever, and we talk all the time, you know. And then I started getting to know Eugenie, you know, especially through the painting side, you know, and then I was like, well, wait a minute, you know, we should just do this together. And then Tom said they've never done a talk together. So now I'm saying, but you guys are doing this talk just like you would do the talks on the Zoom dinners.
Yeah, that's true.
You're kind of organizing yourselves, you know.
Okay, so I'm choosing one, and then you choose the next. All right. Yeah, so we've been together for 40 years, and we've never been on stage together, ever, before today.
Maybe there's a reason for that.
We'll talk later. Okay, so I'm choosing. I think there's still some more. You have another question you've been writing down? Oh, you're taking notes. Okay, sorry. Okay, so I'm choosing one that's about social practice. So this is the question, says, what surprises you most about how Project Grow Houses began and where it went? What was the biggest surprise about Project Grow Houses, where it ended up?
Probably the biggest surprise was that, you know, something so, you know, in real terms, and almost like in Ben Davis terms, you know, in terms of impact, it's so small. You know, it's such a small little gesture, right? I mean, really, I mean, in terms of like, you know, the scale of need and challenges, but that it had such a huge impact. I mean, that's the thing that surprised me the most, that, you know, this little thing in 3rd Ward, Houston, you know, is talked about and have relevance in many pockets of the world. I mean, that was just, I mean, I would have never
I will
thought
contest this idea that's small. I mean, so first of all, duration, decades. It's measured in decades. A lot of social practice projects happen on a weekend or a month or a year. When we did a project at the Queens Museum that lasted 7 years with immigrant movement, that was by far the biggest and longest thing we ever did. So it isn't small by social practice standards.
Yeah, right. But yeah, by social practice standards, yeah.
But then its influence, of course, I will grant you, I agree, is just, way beyond the physical footprint of Project Grow House in Houston.
And that was kind of, that's when I mean, that was part of my answer to Ben Davis' question about, you know, the impact. The impact may only affect a small amount of people in the context of that project, but it's influencing people throughout.
Yes.
You know, and you don't know how that influence is manifesting itself, you know, in different places, so.
Okay.
Give me the tile.
As part of the Black Wall Street project, you made a large, beautiful painting. Yes, one of them is in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum, so happy to say, which was in social work, the best. And what happened there that inspired this work? What happened there specifically that inspired this work? I think the body of work.
You know, one of the things that I decided with painting, and this goes back to a question you asked earlier I didn't quite get to, but you know, that, you know, there is a side of the painting that's just purely formal, and you know, it's about color, it's about shape, it's about, you know, texture and trying to do that kind of stuff. But you know, as someone who is political, you know, and I've in the work, the social practice work is political, you know, in its own way. You know, I didn't think, well, I just thought like the paintings could also play in that role, you know, on some level. And so I started to think about the fact that even though projects like Project Grow House has been around for, you know, nearly 30 years, and hopefully many, many more, but it's still, it's a time-based project, and it's ephemeral in a sense. And then making paintings is something that could potentially, you know, hold for much longer. And so I thought, you know, maybe on some of these works, you know, I can try to, you know, position a work where it could carry the history of some of these projects or these issues that I'm concerned about, that goes beyond the ephemeral nature of them. And so with Black Wall Street Journey, that what I wanted to do with that was just to to create a body of work that was created at the time I was working with the folks in Tulsa on the centennial of the Tulsa massacre, and recognizing that the Tulsa massacre was a horrific tragedy, but there was the other side of it that a lot of people weren't talking about, which was the economic power that caused that tragedy. The Black Wall Street that was that the community there was called. And so I wanted to just create a space within the paintings, move a bit beyond just the formal, and to connect it, to this idea. And so just like the Project Row Houses and the Victoria Square project pieces, they're not narratives and that kind of stuff, but they are, but they try to pull something, just even if it's in the title, But like that piece over there, that one's called Biggers and Boys, Project Row Houses, Biggers and Boys. And that became it's very important to me and significant to me to have John Biggers, who probably hardly, people in the art world don't know John Biggers. They don't.
We have one of his paintings.
Huh?
I said we have one of his paintings.
Oh.
It's actually pretty well known.
Yeah. Well, but people don't, John Biggers was mostly considered a regional artist. And he never tried to do New York. That was just, but he was, as significant of an artist as Jacob Lawrence and all the other artists of that period. But he, he's kind of marginalized. So in that painting, I wanted to have John Biggers' name associated with Joseph Beuys. Someone who's conceptual and all that stuff, and then someone like John Biggers that some people would just kind of say that he was a community kind of artist, that kind of thing. And so, those titles and focuses on series and that kind of stuff, it's about trying to create almost a safe haven for some of these projects or these ideas that they can stay.
I like that idea of a safe haven.
Yeah.
So by the way, that reminds me, I shamefully didn't see it, but there was this, I guess, Charles White show at MoMA, and David Hammond said, they asked him to do a project in response. So he said, I want you to put a Charles White drawing in the room with a Leonardo da Vinci, right?
Yeah, it was amazing.
And so that was it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm putting, this guy can go toe-to-toe with Leonardo da Vinci.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a question which I'm not 100% sure I understand. Somebody wrote this. I think it's a very good question, but see if you understand it.
Okay.
Because I think it's a good question. I'm not sure I understand exactly where it's going. Okay. So it's this regarding social sculptures question. Can you connect your projects and the space they embodied and the space they embody as a communion?
As a communion? As a communion. I'm not quite sure what that...
Does somebody who wrote this question want to...
Clarify?
Clarify. Okay, hold on. We're breaking the third wall here.
I brought the word communion into the question because I feel like so much of the power of your projects has brought people together and really activated that opportunity for people to come together. And I was interested whether, when you brought up that early memory that you had in reflection during the pandemic and you're a child in the church, whether there's any connection there between those spaces and those experiences of people coming together.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay, got it. No, yeah, ultimately, I think, for me, social practice is about bringing people together. It's about bringing people together. And that's why, space becomes, so important. you know, that's one of the things that I kind of gleaned as I was trying to understand, you know, what project row houses could be. And I referenced John Biggers. I learned a lot about developing project row houses through John Biggers' work. And John Biggers had these, I would talk to him about community, you know, what makes the communities in his paintings, because he painted a lot of paintings about Black communities. And I was like, what makes these communities? And he talked about, you know, the importance of architecture, you know, art and creativity, education, social safety net, all those kinds of, and so those were the kind of things that influenced me early on, you know, and just understanding like the value of architecture. You know, I mean, I mean, John Biggers would talk about the, you know, the shotgun house, which was the thing that he mostly, one of the things that I was attracted to his work about, you know, the shotgun house, and he talks about how, you know, it's like the body for the community. You know, it is the place that people come out of. You know, they call it the womb. You know, it's where everything starts, the architecture. You know, and so, you know, yeah, it became a significant, you know, thing for me to think about space and how space bring people together, you know, and that's it is a kind of communion there.
So I think I got the message that we had 5 minutes about 3 minutes ago.
One
more question. Okay.
Would you? Does your intention starting a new work ever differ from your intention when that work is complete?
Wait, read it again.
Does your intention starting a new work ever differ from your intention when that work is complete?
I don't know if the intention changes, but certainly the work changes. You know, I mean, the work, you know, dictates its own path for me. You know, I mean, I don't set it out and say what I want it to be and try to make it get there. That's the same as social practice too. I mean, you know, that's Tom, when you were talking about the parallels between, you know, social practice and making paintings, I mean, it really is. I mean, I use the exact same approach for both. I allow, you know, the things that I've done to help me understand what the next thing should be, and never trying to figure out, you know, that I want to get to here. You know, we need to do this particular house or this particular space. I mean, I may have that as an idea, but if you're going and it turns you away from that location, then it's okay. You know, if the painting started as green and it turned blue or yellow, that's okay. You know, and I just kind of allow things to kind of move in the way that feels natural and organic.
So I think we should wrap it up. I'm going to just say I have a final.
I have a final too.
Okay. Well, you should be the final. Do you want to do your final?
No, wait. I have no final.
You got no final.
You guys can hold forth, and I think you should let Rick, of course, have the last word.
No, you go.
I can go first. Okay. You go last. Yeah. So I was just thinking about that. You used the metaphor of filling back the tank up. Yeah. And the emotional drainage of social practice. So as the social practice guy on, you know, that's my life or whatever, I'm really hoping that your tank is full enough to do more social projects. But also, I have to just say, I'm just blown away by this work, and I can't believe what a good painter you are, Rick. I can't believe it. Like, how could somebody, and you're going to be embarrassed by this, and it's probably inappropriate. So, any baseball fans in the room? Okay. You know that Babe Ruth was like the best pitcher in the American League when the Yankees got him. They said, this guy can hit. I mean, this is Rick, is at the top of his profession as a social practice artist. It turns out he's this good a painter. I can't believe it. So, Antoine, thanks for bringing it to us also.
Okay. Well, thank you for your final word, because it fits within my final word.
Okay, there you go.
In Tom's book, Dialogues, Public Art, I remembered this as I started to paint again. I was like, oh my God. Tom asked the question, he says, so do you think you'll ever paint again? This is in like 1997 or something like that, 97 and 98. And I was like, as I was painting, I'm thinking, oh my God, what did I say? I mean, was I one of those people that go, painting's dead, no way I would paint again, or whatever. And I just wanted to know, and actually I went back and I looked at the book, and what did I say? Can you remember? I mean, I just said basically like, I said, I think I said something like, painting is great. It's just not what I'm doing now. It's not whatever. But if the time sets for, which I was real happy about that I had the foresight to say that, I wasn't just trashing painting.
Yeah.
That I have to come here and eat crow. But yeah. Anyway, that's my last word there.